For 500 years, our little island Britain has punched above its weight around the world, getting our way. The means to our success, not just gunboats and commerce, but ruthless power broking, Machiavellian manoeuvring, and plenty of charm. Diplomacy.
Diplomats are the people you don't often get to hear about. It's the kings and queens, the politicians and the generals who dominate the history books. But this series is about my predecessors who championed Britain's interests abroad. Ambassadors and envoys, power brokers and negotiators.
You must never forget that it's British interests which you're there to promote and protect.
You are constantly having to talk to, make deals with, make concessions to, people who in other ways you are doing things which you thoroughly dislike and disapprove of.
You have to be a bit of a schemer, otherwise you can't do the job properly.
As our man in Washington, I saw history in the making. Now I'm going back over the last 5 centuries to put myself in the shoes of different diplomats who helped Britain's rise to greatness and who managed our decline.
Our diplomacy must always be driven by the national interest. That's easier to say than to define, but of one thing we can be sure. Our top priority is, as it has always been, our security.
It's the irreducible national interest. And this is the minimum a diplomat or statesman must try to accomplish.
When I was at school, I was taught that the roaring seas had protected England from invasion for 1,000 years. But back in the 16th century, we were far from safe.
For Queen Elizabeth I, a key line of defence was not the roaring seas, but her spy masters and diplomats, ruthless, pragmatic men like Lord Burleigh and Sir Francis Walsingham, who had made it their life's mission to confound the Queen's foreign Catholic enemies. What I would give to have been in that game. The nearest I got to it was playing cat and mouse with the KGB in Soviet Russia.
In 1572, shocking news arrived from across the Channel, where Elizabeth's chief spy, Walsingham, ran our Paris embassy. Thousands of Protestants had been slaughtered on St. Bartholomew's Day. Throats were slashed and bodies dismembered. The River Seine ran red with blood. Burleigh called it the greatest crime since the crucifixion.
The grisly news from France tapped into a deep fear that a great international Catholic conspiracy would come together to depose Elizabeth and restore Catholicism in England. The Pope had just issued a bull calling for the violent overthrow of this monstrous heretic. Poor Elizabeth. But as they said about Richard Nixon, just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean they aren't out to get you.
The survival of the nation, no less, was at stake, and the Queen immediately summoned a diplomat for help. He was a Cornishman, and his name was Henry Killigrew. Killigrew was one of a new breed of professional diplomats, key players in the 16th century world of rapidly shifting alliances, cold-blooded assassinations, and devious espionage. Elizabeth I might not yet have had a foreign office, but she had moved from the medieval world into a recognizably modern era of professional statecraft, where resident ambassadors abroad kept a wary eye on neighbouring states in the defence of Britain's national interest. So much of real history happens behind the scenes, where diplomacy likes to ply its trade. These days, ambassadors summoned home to see the Foreign Secretary come here, the ambassador's waiting room, at the very heart of the Foreign Office. It can be nerve-wracking, awaiting orders. Eventually, Henry Killigrew's moment came from his queen.
Killigrew had earned a reputation as a troubleshooter whose discretion was such that there is not a single portrait of him. Less than a fortnight after the Paris massacre, Elizabeth gave him instructions for a new and vital foreign mission.
Without even pausing to say goodbye to his wife and children, Killigrew made haste.
From Paris, Walsingham had reported rumours of plans of a French military enterprise against England, and he strongly advised that steps should be taken to shut up what he called the Postern Gate.
And that Postern Gate was Scotland. Edinburgh in 1572 was up for grabs. The 2-year civil war had reached stalemate, and Killigrew's task was to negotiate a settlement between the rival Scottish factions. Holed up inside Edinburgh Castle were the Catholic supporters of the dethroned Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's most dangerous rival for the English crown.
We are the Valley Boys!
Keeping them under siege was the Protestant faction that governed as regent in the name of Mary's infant son, King James.
Why on earth should Elizabeth, as the Texans say, have a dog in this fight? Well, it was already bad enough that Mary had a respectable claim to the English throne. But what really rang the alarm bells in London was the danger of the French joining in on Mary's side. There was an old alliance between Scotland and France against the old enemy England. And what Elizabeth dreaded most of all was Scotland's becoming part of a Catholic axis of evil on England's doorstep.
Well, the old alliance stretches back to the late 13th century. I mean, it had already been running the best part of 400 years by the time we got to Killigrew. But of course, Scotland had just actually come out of a union with France. Mary Queen of Scots' mother, Mary Guise, a very, very formidable woman. I mean, she'd have had Henry Killigrew for breakfast, incidentally. She'd negotiated a union with France. So, I mean, Scotland was in a union with France before it was in a union with England.
Killigrew made it his business to sow mistrust of the French in Scotland by building a network of influential contacts and making sure they all heard the news about the Paris massacre.
That's reasonably typical of the sort of tradition of English statecraft and diplomacy. Divide and rule, so separate your opponents, try to divide to make the enemy uncertain. And the fairness to that sort of statecraft, I mean, you could argue that kept an empire together for the best part of 200 years.
Before I went as ambassador to Saudi Arabia, a very wise predecessor of mine gave me a word of advice which I've subsequently passed on to a lot of younger members of the Foreign Service, and that was, if it moves, call on it. And I spent a lot of my time, and I may say the recipients of my calls were very tolerant of it, I spent a lot of my time just simply calling on people, not necessarily to do any particular piece of work, but to keep in contact, because you never know when you're going to need that contact.
Scotland was a bracing experience for a Sassanach diplomat. Even Killigrew, a Machiavellian's Machiavelli, felt obliged to report to Elizabeth and her advisers
that these men be so devilled and uncertain in their doings as I cannot tell what to write of them. But of this your honour may be assured, I trust no one farther than I can see with my eyes or feel with my fingers. What, so trusting, Killigrew? First Minister, what does that tell you about the way in which the English tried to deal with the Scots?
Well, it just tells me that Henry was a diplomat, wasn't he? Sent abroad to lie for his country. So his attitude to the Scots was no different from what his attitude to the French or anyone else would have been. I think it's a bit much if you're sent in effectively as a spy to try and interfere in the Scottish succession than to start complaining about your hosts as opposed to complaining about your own nefarious motives.
The Scottish Catholics inside the castle might have been wise not to trust Killigrew himself too far. There was also a hidden agenda to Killigrew's mission, a set of instructions that dared not speak its name, an enterprise so hush-hush that it was written down in a separate document. These secret instructions were drafted by Elizabeth's main advisor and Killigrew's brother-in-law, Lord Burleigh. You can see from the crossings out that this was, shall we say, a tricky document to write. It is found daily, more and more, that the continuance of the Queen of Scots here is so dangerous, both for the person of the Queen's Majesty and for her state and realm, as nothing presently is more necessary than that the realm might be delivered of her. Killigrew was being instructed by Elizabeth to devise a plan that would deliver Mary Queen of Scots into the hands of her Scottish enemies. Use all good speed with the most secrecy that you can to understand their minds, and yet to deal to your uttermost that this matter might be rather opened to you than yourself to seem first to move it. In other words, cunningly persuade the regent's party to assassinate Mary and make them think it's their own idea. Mary was a threat to the throne and to England's security. She had to go, and without the English Queen getting her hands dirty. For Killigrew, with his strong Protestant faith and intense loyalty to the Queen, if the nation were under threat, the end justified any means. Softly, softly, he sounded out the regent's party, headed by the Earls of Mar and Morton, about carrying out judicial murder on behalf of the English Queen. Give us money and soldiers, and only then will we do your dirty work, they said. But Killigrew knew that Elizabeth would be extremely reluctant to get involved in a costly war in Scotland. So how could he keep the Protestant party on side? Killigrew could not promise what his queen was unwilling to deliver, but he knew better than to give an outright refusal. He disappeared into a fog of vague assurances to keep his allies on side, even feigning illness at one particularly tricky moment. It's a tried and tested weapon in the diplomat's armoury, playing for time.
Well, I'm not sure that being a Machiavellian scheming type is not actually a rather good description of what a diplomat ought to be. You have to be very thoughtful. You have to find ways to get your way, to get your country's way. And often that means you can't be entirely straightforward. What you must never do is lie. Once you lie, your credibility is destroyed, not just on that occasion, but forever. So you have to be very careful. But equally, there are ways and ways of presenting things, and perhaps occasionally withholding certain aspects which could be considered relevant, but maybe you don't want to emphasize. So you have to be a bit of a schemer. Otherwise, you can't do the job properly.
As New Year's Day 1573 dawned, the ceasefire between the Scottish factions was broken by cannon fire. Mary's party in the castle fired a warning shot onto the town below. They expected military help from France imminently and were spoiling for a fight. With Scotland once again at boiling point, Killigrew decided that he needed new instructions urgently. He made a secret trip home. The time had come for diplomacy to be backed by force. he had to persuade the Queen to send guns and troops to help the Regent's Party defeat the Scottish Catholics, even though they were now backpedaling from joining the secret plot to kill Mary.
Sometimes a diplomat has to use his arts of persuasion as much back home as in the country to which he is posted, getting your government, or in this case your Queen, to accept that you know better what is in the nation's interest. I have to admit that my own record in this respect was patchy at the best of times. But you're failing in your duty if you don't tell it like it is. And too bad if that is not the message that people want to hear back home.
You have to recommend on policy, and you haven't to be afraid in your recommendations. The worst kind of diplomat is one who tells his foreign secretary what he thinks the minister wants to hear.
Talking the notoriously stubborn Elizabeth into anything wasn't easy. But Killigrew was a trusted and above all persuasive advisor. And he returned to Scotland with 10,000 gold crowns for the regent, to be followed by an army of 1,500 English soldiers.
The English guns sailed into Leith Harbour and trundled up here to face the castle walls. It must have been an impressive sight, and a sight to fill you with dread if you were standing guard on the ramparts. Even Killigrew, who had once been a soldier, got his hands dirty and helped dig the gun mounts with pick and spade. The only time I used an ambassadorial shovel was to plant a tree in the embassy vegetable garden.
When the guns finally opened fire, it took just 11 days' bombardment before the eastern defences of the medieval castle came crashing to the ground. Thanks to Killigrew's resourcefulness, astute reading of the situation, and deft footwork, the Queen's enemies were confounded and the postern gate shut tight. It was not a moment too soon. Inside the castle, Killigrew found the smoking gun, hard evidence that the defeated rebels had been expecting help, not just from the French, but from Catholic Spain as well. As to Mary Queen of Scots, she never did suffer extraordinary rendition to Scotland, but 14 years later, she felt the English executioner's axe.
500 years on, Henry Killigrew is sitting on his diplomatic cloud, observing us from the great Foreign Office in the sky. He'll see that much has changed. Quills and manuscripts have gone, replaced by strange infernal machines. And the magnificence of the ambassador in his doublet, codpiece and hose have given way to boring suits. But Killigrew could have done my job in Washington, just as I hope I could have done his in Edinburgh, because the essential skills of the diplomatic trade have remained unchanged. The ability to negotiate, to interpret, to persuade. All of this to get your way in the nation's interest.
For a young diplomat like me, the Madrid embassy in General Franco's dying days was an exciting place to be. But it was regularly blighted by the protocol hell of having to organise the ambassadors' dinner parties.
I was far too junior to be invited myself, but I had to spend hours devising seating plans that reflected the fiendish complexity of Spanish protocol. I got it wrong once when a duque walked out of the ambassador's dinner because he thought a mere marquess had a better seat.
The ambassador's receptions are noted in society for their host's exquisite taste that captivates his guests.
Truth is, life wasn't a million miles away from the cliché of the diplomatic circuit. Though in all my time, I never clapped eyes on a Ferrero Rocher.
Eccellente.
Monsieur, who is Ferrero Rocher? You're spoiling us.
Ferrero Rocher, a sign of good taste.
So, does this flim-flam matter? Diplomatic history tells us that it does. The peace and security of Europe has even depended on it.
It's the capital of the Austrian Empire in late 1814. And just about everyone who was anyone accepted an invitation to attend the Congress of Vienna. The city's population swelled by 100,000 visitors. The hosts laid on for their guests 1,500 liveried servants, more than 100 new carriages, and 1,200 extra horses, all of them white. Beethoven was on hand to compose and conduct the music, as Europe's statesmen and their wives and mistresses gathered to join a party which would
I missed my time by a couple of centuries or so. The European Union in bureaucratic Brussels, this was not. But glittering parties aplenty, and most important of all, a real sense of history in the making.
The delegates had gathered to bring peace to the continent after decades of warfare.
Perhaps the most important person in town was not the Austrian Emperor, not the Russian Tsar, and certainly not a mere king, though Prussia, Denmark, Bavaria and Württemberg all sent theirs. He was the British representative, in my book, one of Britain's greatest diplomats.
Robert Stewart, Viscount Castlereagh, an Anglo-Irishman in his mid-40s, was Britain's Foreign Secretary. He arrived in Vienna in 1814 with one guiding principle, that security and peace for England depended on security and peace in Europe. The French Revolution 25 years earlier had set in motion a war that saw most of Europe fall to Napoleon before his eventual defeat, leading to abdication and exile. Now, in 1814, it was time to divide the spoils, and from a myriad of competing claims, draw up in Vienna a new blueprint for Europe's reconstruction.
Here was a situation where Europe had been at war for nearly a quarter of a century. It's quite a difficult thing for us to imagine, because we've not experienced that in our lifetimes, thankfully, or indeed ever since, although there's been the First and Second World Wars. There hasn't been a war of that length, an almost entire generation in length, of conflict in Europe from 1792 onwards. And so the people who came to the end of that conflict were looking for an entirely new framework, looking for something that would mean there would be no more wars in Europe. So they were looking for a very ambitious solution.
Behind him, Castlereagh had the might of the growing British Empire, deep pockets, and unchallenged naval supremacy. So what Britain wanted, Britain was likely to get.
Castlereagh was our first great foreign secretary. He had to do two things. He had to keep together the coalition against Napoleon, which was always splitting off. He had to keep it together with money, with persuasion. And secondly, when we'd beaten Napoleon, he had to negotiate the peace. He had the Russians' troops all over Europe. He had the Russian Tsar, a very strange man, who was insisting on keeping Poland, but also had all kinds of Christian ideas about the shape of Europe. He had to deal with the French. How do you keep France as an important European power while not allowing her to rampage again as she had under Napoleon? He had to deal with all kinds of very tricky situations and people.
Like all good negotiators, Castlereagh had an eye for detail. He was incredibly diligent and knew that being thoroughly on top of his brief was the most vital weapon in the diplomatic armory. Austria's spies reported that he even prepared to the point of practicing the latest waltzes with a chair. Today, the nearest one gets to the Malay of 19th century Vienna is the annual officers' ball at the Hofburg Palace, which hosted many of the Congress's grand soirees. The Congress saw the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in France and a scramble by the mustachioed scions of Europe's Ancien Régime to get back what Napoleon had seized from them. So the ambitions of the Congress were intensely conservative, but the way it set about achieving them certainly wasn't.
The unending round of balls and entertainments, the bed hopping, the pillow talk, everybody rubbing shoulders with everybody else from the Russian Tsar and Austrian Emperor downwards, this was a diplomatic revolution. It was the start of informal networking, which, despite all appearances, was absolutely avant-garde.
Entertainment is important, provided it is focused. I found one of the most satisfying ways of entertaining as an ambassador was if the entertainment was designed to introduce A to B.
When people have met over a period of time, they find it easier to relax, they find it easier to get to know each other, and that getting to know people is essential if you're going to reach agreements which are going to work.
If, to quote Churchill, Jaw was to prevail over war, the diplomats would have to agree to a generally acceptable balance between all the competing interests. So Castlereagh was faced with a task of fiendish intricacy.
Of course, with such a vast throng and such a complex agenda, it's nearly always mission impossible to get anything significant agreed. Just look at the European Union with its 27 member states. When I was in Brussels, we couldn't even get the then 10 members to agree tariffs on the import of Romanian shoes. Castlereagh's genius was to work the room tirelessly, to get alongside everyone, to make even the smallest duke feel important, and then to cut most of them out of the decision-taking. And that's multilateral diplomacy today. If you think it's difficult to get consensus out of the United Nations Security Council, imagine how it would be if decisions had to be taken by the almost 200 members of the United Nations General Assembly.
As Castlereagh himself put it, in such a large confederacy, an equality and community of council is utterly incompatible with the march of business. So though there were numerous nationalities, the Italians, Belgians, Poles, jostling for a place at the negotiating table to have a say in their own futures, Castlereagh realised that lasting peace depended before all else on striking a deal between the great powers, regardless of who else got trampled in the process.
Now, of course, there were many controversial aspects of this, because the solution involved a strong active role for the major powers in Europe, and a rather aggrandizement of something of an aggrandizement of medium-sized powers, in order to create more of an equilibrium. And that meant the extinction of some small countries, and it showed in one of the quotations of the time, no special tenderness to nationality. Which meant that people were lumped together in countries that they probably didn't really feel they belonged to. And of course, in the long term, that would create some difficulties. But this is often one of the conflicts in foreign policy. Are you looking for an equilibrium that guarantees the peace, or are you trying to give people their rights to be citizens of the countries they want to be in, to self-determination? Those two things don't always sit together. And Castlereagh was very much on the side of the balance of power, of law and security, rather than nationality.
Back from ball after ball, Castlereagh burnt the midnight oil, plotting a course through the well-nigh intractable issues which kept the parties poised between peace and renewed conflict.
A barrier had to be built against a revanchist France, which meant a strong Netherlands, whatever the Belgians said. An expansionist Russia, threatening from the east, had designs on Poland where they had placed 200,000 troops. Poor old Poles.
Meanwhile, how to create that vital counterweight in Central Europe against any Franco-Russian alliance. And then there was a dangerous rivalry between Prussia and Austria, with Prussia threatening war unless it got all of Saxony to compensate for any losses in Poland. And that was anathema to Austria, who would then demand some kind of compensation in Italy, not to mention kicking the balls to the King of Saxony. And this was not all. There was a huge range of other issues to be grappled with, such as ending the slave trade, preserving the emancipation of the Jews, regulating Europe's internal waterways. If Castlereagh ever felt tired, he was said to snatch an hour's rest by dozing in the bath. Castlereagh was also expected to do his share of entertaining, though his soirees were notoriously meagre. It's still an essential part of diplomatic life in the British Embassy in Vienna. Tonight's host is the British Ambassador to Austria, Simon Smith, and he's a defender of the ambassador's reception against its critics.
Simon, Norman Tebbit once said notoriously that just as the Ministry of Agriculture existed to look after the interests of farmers, so the Foreign Office existed to look after the interests of foreigners. I mean, what's the riposte to that?
I think the riposte is that if you don't understand what makes foreigners work, if you don't understand what makes a country that you're accredited to, what makes its government do what it does, what makes its people feel the way they do, think the way they do, then you're not going to be terribly good at getting them to agree to see things your way, at getting them to line up with British objectives. I think that one can make the mistake that by understanding a country that you're working in, you are supporting its position, you are advocating that country's
You would never
position.
go native.
I would never go native, but you are more likely to get listened to in advocating that position if you demonstrate an understanding of where your partners across the table are coming from, and you won't get that understanding unless you make an effort.
It is an occupational danger to go native, and every once in a while, or more than every once in a while, when I worked in the State Department or the White House, I would see people who began to see too much of their job as explaining them to us as opposed to us to them. And every once in a while I used to take them aside and say, remember, you work for the blue team. We are the blue team. And it's good to have your take on them, but your bigger job, quite honestly, is to make us understandable to them and to make our case.
As the Congress moved towards its diplomatic climax, the entertainments grew ever more elaborate. In January 1815, a party came out to the palace here at Schönbrunn. The grand procession of 32 sleighs was led by an orchestra. At the same time, Castlereagh's fragile coalition of great powers was inching towards a compromise, and a deal that redrew the map of Europe.
The significance of the Congress of Vienna is that it ushered in the longest period of peace without general war in European history. In the 100 years that followed it, there were only local conflicts, and never involving all the powers simultaneously. That was a considerable achievement. So Castlereagh's contribution was seminal, and his tenacity made it possible.
Castlereagh understood that for Europe to remain at peace, a balance of power was not enough, and there needed to be a system of regular meetings between nations to diffuse problems before they blew up. And that is what the Congress of Vienna created. It was, to use the jargon of today, a system of multilateral collective security.
Castlereagh certainly favoured strong diplomatic engagement with the other powers of Europe, wanted a concert of Europe. They really saw the guarantee of the settlement that he and his colleagues arrived at being the major European powers working together and being prepared to actively defend the settlement, militarily defend, if necessary, the settlement that they had arrived at. So yes, that is strong active engagement in Europe. And I don't think any British statesmen have ever been in favour of anything else other than strong active engagement in Europe. The debate now is whether strong active engagement means automatically signing up to anything that is ever proposed in the rest of Europe, or being prepared to give a lead ourselves.
Castlereagh was, of course, himself no visionary idealist. In fact, he refused to sign up to the Tsar's grander vision, the Holy Alliance, of a united Europe of shared Christian values.
Sublime mysticism and nonsense, he called it. For Castlereagh, that was taking a shared European project too far.
In our more liberal age, the Congress of Vienna has a terrible reputation for the way the great powers rode roughshod on the smaller nationalities. After the First World War, Woodrow Wilson hoped that no odour of Vienna would influence the peace settlement. David Miliband, not so long ago, declared that Europe cannot have its destiny settled on the basis of the Congress of Vienna. In his own time, poor old Castlereagh's reputation also suffered. His achievements were taken for granted, and yet he was blamed for failing to achieve the impossible: democracy, self-determination for small nations, and universal happiness. He became the whipping boy for England's liberal set. And through it all, he never stopped working. In August 1822, he confessed, "I am quite worn out. This is more than I can bear." 4 days later, he killed himself.
When the great statesman was brought here to Westminster Abbey to be buried, the hearse had to make its way through a mob of jeering protesters. And could poor Castlereagh rest in peace? Not a bit of it. Byron wrote this epitaph: "Posterity will ne'er survey a nobler grave than this. Here lie the bones of Castlereagh. Stop, traveller, and piss." Diplomacy is sometimes a thankless task.
It was April 2002, and Tony Blair and his team, including me, had been invited to President Bush's Texas ranch for what the press were calling a council of war. This was a crucial moment. The big question was, would Blair put British security on the line and sign on for a regime change in Baghdad?
On arrival, Blair was whisked off for a tete-a-tete with the president. Indeed, for most of the weekend he was alone. No advisors, nobody to record what was agreed. A diplomat's nightmare. Meanwhile, the rest of us, Condi Rice, Alistair Campbell, and so on, went off to a nearby Tex-Mex restaurant for dinner. The president's political guru, Karl Rove, flew in his bootmaker, who measured me up for these superb specimens, suitably emblazoned and adding at least 2 inches to your height. I never did find out exactly what Blair committed to that weekend. Afterwards, the Americans believed that he was on board for whatever they decided to do in Iraq. It may have been a case of good personal relations leading to a hug too close. But in modern times, there's no doubt that Britain's security has sometimes depended on how well the two at the top really get on.
In 1962, just before Christmas, 2 aircraft carrying 2 national leaders flew towards the same destination. They were heading for a showdown that would determine Britain's international role, in particular, whether Britain could continue to have a seat at the top table as a nuclear power.
Elderly Prime Minister Harold Macmillan spent much of the flight reading Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. History does not relate whether this was for amusement or for instruction, but the harsh truth was that the British Empire too was disintegrating. India had gone, colonies were breaking away, and Britain's recent bitter humiliation at Suez had underlined our diminished, vulnerable position. Macmillan would be negotiating from weakness, the supreme test for diplomacy.
Much more comfortable was the popular young president sitting in the other aircraft.
Something to drink, sir?
Yeah, Bloody Mary, please. John F. Kennedy had every reason to feel pretty sure of himself. He was, after all, president of the most powerful nation that the world had ever seen. As Castlereagh and his Victorian successors had discovered, this makes getting your way in the world a darn sight easier.
Macmillan staked his foreign policy on 2 things: a close relationship with America and on Britain's possessing an independent nuclear deterrent. Now both were at risk. America was threatening to go back on its offer to sell Britain nuclear missiles.
So the stakes could not have been higher. But riding on Air Force One with the President was Macmillan's secret weapon. A Brit with a very special relationship. Her Britannic Majesty's Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary to the United States of America.
David Ormsby Gore arrived in Washington in 1961. He was considered a brilliant appointment because of his brilliant contacts. Macmillan's nephew by marriage and an old family friend of the Kennedys. When I got the same job 36 years later, Number 10 told me to get up the arse of the White House and stay there. Not very elegantly put, but I understood the point. In diplomacy, access is everything. And David Ormsby Gore had access to the president, for which ambassadors would sell their grandmothers.
Ormsby Gore was practically a family member of the Kennedys. And I was a consultant to the Kennedy administration. He was infinitely closer to the Kennedys than I was, even though I was technically working in the White House.
Being his private secretary gave me an extraordinary, a very exciting insight into what life was like in what was called Camelot. I mean, these glamorous characters who piled into the British ambassador's residence, including the president himself.
It was marvellous, but they didn't seem to appreciate how many errors as obvious.
He impressed me immediately as a very intelligent, likable man who shared the same ideals and objectives that Kennedy and I already shared.
So here we are in the British Embassy residence, 3100 Massachusetts Avenue. This is where all the guests would come and attending receptions or lunches or dinner. In our time, we reckon we had about 12,000 of them every year. To be greeted by the ambassador and his wife, somewhere around about there. You would stand here saying, good evening, how are you? Welcome to the British Embassy. This is my wife, Catherine. After you've done that about 200 times, your brain started to go. And once I called my wife by the name of my ex-mother-in-law. But there you go. If you shake a lot of hands, you lose your sanity after a while. This is a great ballroom. This is how you put networks of high-level contacts together, networks of influence. You brought them in
to the house and gave them a good time. That's new. A picture of the Queen. So you go down here towards the drawing room. This is a very good place in which to just have a handful of influential American friends. You could sit around in a circle here and have a really good political discussion.
With his contacts on both sides of the Atlantic, Ormsby Gore was the perfect middleman to oil the relationship between President and Prime Minister. A vital role, because by the end of 1962, Anglo-American relations were strained almost to breaking point. Early in December, former Secretary of State Dean Acheson made his notorious speech declaring that Britain had lost an empire and not yet found a role.
Britain, I think, was struggling to find a role and hadn't at that point decided whether to join the EEC, as it then was. It had a difficult relationship with the United States over the Suez crisis, where Britain and France had really been abandoned, as they might have seen it, by the United States, had not been supported by the United States.
Acheson's wild words have caused an international furore.
About this Acheson thing, Jack. It's Harold here. Harold Macmillan. M-A-C-R. I'm calling from London. Now, looky here. This thing doesn't represent the views of your government, does it? Oh. Well, goodbye then.
Acheson's scorn exacerbated a row already brewing between Britain and America over their cooperation on a missile called Skybolt. This was Britain's main hope for an independent nuclear future.
Ormsby Gore was summoned to a meeting with the Secretary for Defense, Robert McNamara. There he heard that while no final decision had been taken, the Americans were seriously considering Skybolt's cancellation. The missile was failing tests and proving exorbitantly expensive. For any ambassador, news like this is red alert. It demands an urgent report to London. That evening, Ormsby Gore's reporting telegram was sent off, classified emergency and top secret.
I said I was sure he would realize that a decision to abandon the Skybolt program would be political dynamite so far as the United Kingdom was concerned.
Harold Macmillan was furious. He instructed the ambassador to make sure the president didn't decide anything until the two sides had consulted.
Macmillan asked Ormsby Gore whether he should telephone Kennedy. Technology had, of course, moved on since Killigrew or Castlereagh, and it wouldn't be long before hotlines connected the world's most powerful leaders. But there are dangers to bypassing the local ambassador, as Ormsby Gore knew well. A golden rule of diplomacy that has remained unchanged by technology is to get your timing right when you deploy your biggest gun. Ormsby Gore advised Macmillan to hold off. Only a face-to-face meeting with Kennedy stood any chance of success.
It's very often thought that by telephoning your opposite number every month or so, a head of government can do the job perfectly well that these expensive ambassadors don't need to do. The fact is that an ambassador is a continuity man in constant contact with the locals, and governments have found that they can't do business without some intermediary.
Diplomats tend to be professional, whereas much diplomacy these days is conducted by politicians who are very definitely not professional. So a good diplomat spends a lot of his time clearing up the mess, trying to repair things that politicians have either broken or trying to put into some usable form the very broad conclusions which politicians have reached. It's a bit of a thankless task. These days it's probably much more fun, much more professionally interesting in out-of-the-way countries where politicians are less tempted to go.
So it was that in late December, Prime Minister and President set out for the Bahamas for the showdown over Skybolt. It was highly unusual for a foreign ambassador to travel on Air Force One. But Ormsby-Gore's special relationship got him a ride, and half an hour's tete-a-tete with the President.
If you ditch Skybolt, the consequences for our relations and for the Prime Minister personally would be very severe. He would be desperately exposed and the government might fall. I fear also that if the British public think that they have been let down by the United States, a storm of anti-Americanism will sweep the country.
As I know myself, the Americans are not overly sensitive to the domestic politics of others. But thanks to Ormsby-Gore's intervention, perhaps Kennedy had begun to be persuaded that it was not in America's interest to leave Macmillan high and dry and provoke a political crisis in Britain.
Ambassador and President hammered out a deal. The Americans would not themselves procure Skybolt, but would offer to split its development costs 50-50 with the Brits. Would this generous gesture of good faith placate the Prime Minister and avoid a huge row in the Bahamas?
Mr. Macmillan flew into the Bahamas late on Monday night for what many of them were calling the worst moment in Anglo-American relations since Suez.
Welcome, Macmillan and Kennedy.
Then, in the warm sunshine of this British island colony, full airport ceremonial for the arrival of President Kennedy.
The whole world is making a fuss about a Skybolt that came up to discuss. But you can be sure, definitely, we have the maximum security. We don't mind Russia saying this or that. 3 cheers for Stars and Stripes and the Union Jack. Yes, I said welcome. Welcome, your visit to Nassau will go down in history.
Ormsby-Gore had done all he could. It was time to hand the diplomatic baton to the Prime Minister.
Ormsby-Gore briefed the Prime Minister on the 50-50 deal that Kennedy was offering. The ambassador's groundwork mollified Macmillan, but he'd already made up his mind. If Skybolt wasn't good enough for the Americans, it wasn't good enough for the British. The talks were to take place at a secluded luxury villa, Bali High, lent to Macmillan for the occasion. This is the moment of truth, straight talking, statesman to statesman. It's where personal chemistry can really make the difference. And luckily, Macmillan and Kennedy got on.
What made Macmillan so captivating for Kennedy was that Kennedy was a bit of a romantic, and Macmillan seemed to him like a breath from Edwardian England, where the great and the good were comfortable with the use of power but weren't vulgarized by it. Macmillan was able to play act the role of the wise Greek to the sturdy young Roman emperor.
Face-to-face personal chemistry is very important, perhaps more important now than before, because of the number of occasions in which they are actually face-to-face. The fact that Macmillan and Kennedy were on those terms, the fact that Margaret Thatcher was on bad terms with Helmut Kohl, the German Chancellor, they do make a difference. You must try and prevent them so dominating the scene that you forget the realities. I think some of the rhetoric about our relationship with America does get out of control, and it arouses expectations which
Macmillan made the speech of his life. He talked emotionally about British sacrifice in the wars. He charted the historic friendship between America and Britain, and waxed lyrical about his own personal
out all the diplomatic stops. Alongside his emotional appeal, he kept everyone on edge by repeatedly adjourning the discussions to consult Ormsby, Gore and the team, insisting that no agreement was better than a bad compromise. It was a masterpiece of play acting and of diplomatic technique. And it worked.
Against all the British expectations and against the advice of his own State Department, Kennedy agreed to let Britain have Polaris.
Kennedy would not have done that for the French. He would not have done that for the Germans, the Italians, not even for Israel, which has its own unique qualities of relationship. So the fact that he did it for England, I'd rather say he did it for Macmillan, shows that the relationship was indeed special.
Britain got a bargain. A better missile than Skybolt, without having to pay any of the initial research and development costs.
This final agreement was reached by some masterly ambiguity, which blurred the lines between independence and interdependence. Polaris would be under NATO, except where Her Majesty's government may decide that the supreme national interests were at stake, which is, of course, the only time you would need a nuclear weapon.
What was agreed here at Barley High remains the basis of our security policy to this day and beyond. In the 1980s, we acquired Trident, the successor to Polaris, on similar terms. And we're still committed to Britain's remaining nuclear well into the 2040s.
At the end of the day, our security is in our own hands. Of course, we have the alliance with the United States. But really, even in the best circumstances, you should be able to defend yourself. We had the nuclear technology. We were one of the first to acquire it. I think our giving it up would have been a sign of resigning from a leading role in the world. It is the ultimate deterrent.
I think the security of Britain is the fundamental aim of British policy. The threat of security comes in all shapes and sizes. Not long ago it was the Soviet Union. Now you can argue that it's terrorism. In a few years' time it may be the threat from the deteriorating planet, i.e. the threat will change. But all the time, your fundamental objective is the security, the safety of these islands and the people who live in them.
Ormsby, Gore and Macmillan achieved a remarkable victory for British diplomacy. It cemented our position in the first rank of great powers, it improved the relationship with the United States of America, and above all, it protected our security in a nuclear world.
You might not have heard of Killigrew, Castlereagh or Ormsby Gore, but the lesson of history is clear. True national security is not possible without effective diplomacy. In the next program, I'll explore the history of our troubled diplomatic relationship with China, beset by rows over opium, protocol, and Hong Kong, and how it has so often come down to money.
Moolah.
Coming up tonight here on BBC4, we go behind all the red tape and spin to the beating heart of some of the government's biggest departments. More corridors of power catch up with the great offices of state next.